zweiten Beitrag zur Afrika-Reihe. Ich begrüße heute Geert Laporte, er ist Direktor des ECDPM, European Think Tank Group, und Direktor im ECDPM. Das ist der Think Tank, der vielleicht am meisten mit der Europäischen Union zusammenarbeitet in allen Sachen, die Entwicklung und in allen Sachen, die Afrika betreffen. Geert arbeitet dort seit Jahren zu diesem Thema. Wir kennen uns seit lange und ich schätze seine Ansichten ganz besonders. Er hat hunderte Artikel zu diesen Themen geschrieben und keiner ist besser berufen als er, darüber etwas zu sagen. Geert, we have agreed, and thank you for accepting this invitation for an interview. I know how busy you are, that you would say something perhaps first about the state of EU-AU relations or EU-Africa relations in general. Where are we today? And then how are things going to be in the coming months, considering what COVID has done to both of our continents? And you will do most of the talking. From time to time, I might wish to put another question, but please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Guten Morgen to everyone who is listening in on this. What I would like to say is that basically I would distinguish three periods in this Europe-Africa partnership. And of course, there's a very long history, but let's start our history in 2007, when the European Union and the African Union, that was newly created at that moment. The European African Union only exists since 2002. Before we had the Organization of African Unity. But the African Union came into being in 2002. And so in 2007, we had the second Europe-Africa Summit in Lisbon, where a joint Africa-Europe strategy was adopted. And for me, there was a bit a renewal in the way Europe and Africa were going to deal with each other. The intention was to have a continental partnership between Africa as a whole and the European Union, and a continental partnership that would be beyond North-South typical development cooperation relationships, partnership based on mutual interests. Very promising, but not easy to achieve the ambitions in the course of the years, because we've seen that there were quite some tensions on major issues related to migration. Also, the trade chapter, economic partnership agreements, was not always perceived by the African side to be a sign of an equal, mutually based interest partnership. So the jazz lost a bit of momentum. And I would say that there is a second period then, after quite a few years, with, first of all, the Juncker alliance at the end of Juncker's term, but definitely with Ursula von der Leyen, when she came into office at the end of last year. She was very much promoting a geopolitical European Commission and very much in favor of strengthening the ties with Africa. And she clearly showed that Europe had a genuine interest in Africa by traveling in a very short period of time, twice to Addis. Africa was our preferred partner, our closest neighbor, and this was very much what Ursula von der Leyen wanted to stress. But at the same time, we saw that it was not so easy again to move into this type of equal partnership with mutual interests. The European Union presented a strategy on the 9th of March of this year, a new strategy with Africa. It was a bit more modest than some of the previous strategies. There were some promising elements in it, but at the same time, we also saw a kind of skepticism on the African side. We've had this already The African side also became more assertive and was also not willing to just abide with Europe's proposals. And this is what I would call a bit the second period. And then immediately after that, we entered in this COVID-19 context. And I think this is a third momentum where we have to now look more deeply into the implications on the Europe-Africa partnership. And I can come back on that in a minute. I think you probably would like to put additional questions as to how we look at the implications of COVID-19 for the Europe-Africa partnership. But basically, I think we are moving into a relationship that will be more balanced, maybe not in the immediate and the short term, because if you look at the COVID-19 implications, the economic and social implications will be harder for the more vulnerable regions in this world, and definitely Africa is still a vulnerable region. So there is talk of more aid, there is talk of more support to compensate for the big economic impacts of this COVID-19 crisis. But I think we should look beyond the aid envelopes that will now flow to Africa and that Africa absolutely will need. We are sure about this. There is a need for debt relief. There is a need for substantial aid to compensate, for example, for the loss of remittances of Africans who are working in Europe and elsewhere in the world, and to also compensate for the major capital outflows from Africa at this moment, to compensate also for the big problems in relation to trade and prices of mineral resources, oil and so on. So aid will be needed, let us be very clear about that. But in the medium term and in the longer term, I think we have an opportunity to build a different type of relationship that requires changes on both sides of the partnership. And maybe just to explain how I look at that, I think that this crisis has highlighted in Africa the importance of a stronger and more assertive African perspective on world economics and the way Africa would deal with the European Union. I think this is one of the lessons that we can draw from this. A lot of initiatives have been taken by the African Union. We have solidarity funds in Africa. We have the Center for Disease Controls that have been working quite well. I think it's very important that we see a type of internal change in Africa, but that should be pursued, I think. It should be pursued beyond the immediate crisis impacts. And one of the elements, what I just was saying is that it is important to really look at the number of structural reforms that are needed. If we want to break with the traditional North-South relationship, it will be essential that the African continent, beyond the short-term support that it will get now, that it also organizes itself better to mobilize its own domestic resources. And this will require major reforms of the fiscal administrations. It will make it necessary to break with some of the sometimes corrupt practices of leadership. It should be absolutely considered to make sure that the younger generations and the potential generated by these younger generations are really tapped more intensively. There's a whole range of young people in civil society, in private sector, who would like to take part in the economic reforms, but who are not always given the incentives to participate in the necessary reforms that will be needed. So I think there is definitely there a huge agenda, probably also at the level of the regional organizations. We might go to a type of situation where there will be more regional protectionism, both in Europe and in Africa. We've seen that some of our industries have been heavily dependent on global markets, and probably in Africa, more than in any other region, that dependency has been so high that there will be most probably also a push given to regional integration. But this is all medium and longer term, but it is quite promising. And I think the European Union should also do its part of the job. It should definitely also take some measures that relate to the governance of the partnership. We should get rid of supporting clientelistic types of relationships, which we have been doing far too long as European Union. I'm referring to some of the agreements that are outdated, agreements of the past like ACP-EU, largely based on state-to-state cooperation with certain elites. This is something where Europe also has to make substantial steps forward. Europe should also rationalize this whole aid industry, the aid business, and maybe with COVID-19, quite a few development cooperation organizations that have not been very effective, that have been based sometimes on vested interest, might disappear, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing. We should make sure that we don't duplicate various agreements and initiatives, because this only creates confusion. So these are some of the steps that the European Union could also take, not at least defining better its real value added. And what is it that Europe makes or has as unique selling point vis-à-vis Africa, knowing that we are in a context where there are many more competitors? So these are reflections also needed on the European side. And if both sides take this crisis as an opportunity, I think we can jointly get to a kind of better negotiated deal where we really look at convergence, but definitely also at divergences on many of the thematic and sectoral issues of the partnership. And then we need to negotiate, but negotiate on the basis of equality, making sure that the perspectives of both continents are fully reflected in a negotiated deal on issues like, for example, migration, the green transformation agenda, and a whole range of other issues.
Thank you, Geert. You have really touched the whole breadth of this question. Let me perhaps say for our viewers and listeners, JICE, as you mentioned, is the Joint Africa-European Strategy. Now, let me step back to your series of 3 phases. At the end of the second phase, the last 4 years, our relations were dominated by one theme, and that was migration. And it was really a point that rather hindered any reasonable discussion than anything else. Now, of course, because of Corona, the migration between Africa and Europe has changed in itself. Not fundamentally, but at least it's become less in numbers. And we don't know what is going to be the case after we come out of this crisis. But how do you think that we will be able to get out of such a topic that clearly sometimes prevents discussions more than it furthers it?
Well, I think, first of all, the figures of the last days show again that there is a rise of migration. There is an increase of migration again. It looks as if some of the migration waves are starting up again, not at the same level as we witnessed in 2015, but definitely there is a new migration wave coming. And I think if you just look at the economic implications of COVID-19 in Africa, particularly the informal sector, the small and medium enterprises, the small businesses, and that's the majority of the economy in Africa, I think that this will lead to new migration waves. And so Europe definitely should be prepared, but Europe should also negotiate on this issue in a more generous way with the African side. And issues like, for example, labor mobility should be given much more attention. We also will need, in a number of sectors, this labor mobility when we will have to recover from this crisis, particularly in a number of sectors where we have seen that we do not necessarily have enough capacity. In many European member states, there was a shortage, for example, of people in the health sector. So there is an argument to be made to get legal labor mobility again on the agenda. And I think this is part of a deal. You can, for example, make sure that we don't get the immense flows of migration that some countries are fearing for. There needs to be measures taken on the African side to avoid that. But at the same time, Europe should also give a perspective to Africans, young Africans, that they can travel to Europe, to the European Union, and that they can also be useful in this society. So for me, this is part of a negotiation that should not be one-sided with imposition and just border controls by one side over the other side, but it should be a mutual deal that really should be taken on in the new partnership. And this is just one area. Other areas that definitely will come up now with the discussions in Europe and globally on Black Lives Matter, for example, is the restitution of cultural goods. Also there, we should move beyond lip service. We've had so many times that Africa has put this on the agenda of the partnership, and it was always seen as, yes, we will at some stage bring it up and we will discuss it. But it is quite a sensitive issue in Africa, and I think we should also, as Europeans, be open to deal with this and to negotiate on this and to make sure that the Africans also get concessions from the European side. Because if there is one thing that we've learned in all these years of partnership, then it is definitely the perception in Africa that Europe does not really make concessions on issues that really matter to Africa. And I think this is now the moment to show that we can negotiate deals the way we also make deals with some of our most difficult partners. I would just remind us of the deals that we have concluded with countries like Turkey. So why shouldn't we be able to strike deals with Africa in a more balanced way?
Well, let me just answer on this last point, because it has concerned us also. We have had about half a year ago, Bénédicte Savoy in the Kreisky Forum, who made a very good expose on the whole question of restitution. But the impression was certainly that on our side there is readiness to do something. It's more a question of practical steps to be taken. So we are going to take this up, and I might just mention that a few days ago, one of the opposition parties, not the Socialist Party, but the NEOS, brought in a proposal for a law that would say that we should enter into such discussions for practical steps. We will see that. It will be interesting how the Germans, who are very concerned by this question, will now take this question up during the presidency. But let me go back now to another rather fundamental point. Within this whole gamut of values, there's human rights, and there is democracy, and there is state of law. Rechtsstaatlichkeit, as we said, and together with state of law, you think about governance. And there we see that Africa is more and more irritated by our entering into discussions of that. And the kind of reaction Ursula von der Leyen has got from Moussa Faki was in a way indicating, listen, don't irritate us too much in this direction. How do you see this? Because it's in the way all the things that you now laid out that should be done depend on a minimum of an existence of state of law on both sides?
Well, I think personally, of course, on a number of issues, there are divergences on the value agendas between both continents. We also see it now in the post-Cotonou negotiations. There's quite some major divergences on issues like sexual and reproductive health rights, LGBTI. The whole issue of ICC is still a very delicate one. But essentially, I think that the governance agendas in both continents, if you look at expectations of the populations in both Europe and Africa, I think the governance agenda does not differ that very much. What is the problem, in my view, is the unilateral way in which we have been dealing with governance. And maybe secondly, also the process element that has been lacking in the governance debate. So we should definitely bring more reciprocity into the debate, and we should also bring in the dimension time. You cannot ask countries to change certain governance issues in just a short period of time, and this is not something that can also be imposed from the outside. Sometimes we lose sight of our own history in Europe. We forget how long it took to evolve from authoritarian states, and we still see that this is sometimes happening in states nowadays in the European Union itself. So process is very important, and reciprocity. In that sense, my feeling is that the communication by the European institutions, so the European strategy with Africa, is a bit more showing humility. It talks now about governance issues in both continents, in which the European Union also refers to the problems that we have in certain Eastern European countries. And that's good, that's positive. It gives a certain degree of confidence to the African side. But we should go further. There is more to be done. But on the essence of the agenda, I think we all want this governance dimension to be strengthened. But it is such a vast area of work that we need to be very clear where we should put emphasis. From my personal perspective, I think rule of law is one of the most needed and most important dimensions of the governance dimension. And I think if we can ensure that we have fair justice in most countries in Europe and in Africa, I think we can start from there and move up into a whole range of other governance related issues. Linked to that is of course also the issue of state capacity. We've seen with the COVID-19 crisis that we need states to be strong enough to deal with these types of crises, both at the central level and at the level of local government. There is a need to revalorize, revalue the role of the state in dealing with these types of crises. And this is definitely an issue as much in Europe as it is in Africa. Also in Europe, we've seen that this is a major component. When we were going through this crisis, many states in Europe have shown big failures, and it is important that we also reflect on this ourselves as Europeans.
Well, thank you. That is certainly something to keep in consideration. Let me now go back to the summit. If the date should be end of October, we've just about 4 months. If I understand correctly, for the moment, there hasn't been happening much in concrete preparation. The EU head of delegation in Addis, Ranieri Sabatucci, just said the Africans took some time to reorganize into a virtual state of negotiations and discussions. I also heard there was a problem of interpretation because they normally use 4 languages. So what are the chances of still preparing adequately such a summit? I mean, nobody can say whether it will be a summit person to person or virtual, but how do you see this evolving? Lot of work during summer.
Yeah. First of all, yes, to have this summit organized in the next few months will be extremely difficult. My personal feeling is that a physical summit will not take place, also because some of the African leaders have already indicated that they won't travel. This is also the case with South Africa. President Ramaphosa, chair of the African Union, apparently has indicated that it is no longer in his planning to travel before the end of this year. Maybe he will make an exception for this summit at the end of October, but I doubt. But this means that a lot of the preparatory process, including many of the side events that were scheduled, risk to be either virtual or not taking place. And some of these side events were quite promising. The European External Action Service and the European Commission were planning to organize an Africa Week in Brussels in the week of the 19th to the 23rd of October, with some 6-7 side events of the business community, side events of the social and economic actors, of the civil society, of the think tanks. We also have been getting an invitation as European think tank group to sit together with the African think tanks and change makers. I would say on paper, these were really interesting initiatives, because it was really trying to bring the debate to a broader level by involving the different stakeholders. Also youth would be involved, a very important player. There would also be a kind of youth side event. I'm doubting now whether this will take place, but I would not necessarily say that the process is totally interrupted. Maybe we should just give more time to the time and say, let's postpone this summit and make sure that we have a physical summit with all the preparatory work being done now, let's say in 2021, and maybe have that summit at the end of 2021, so that the process that is now starting up can be pursued, and that a lot of the initiatives that the African Union is now putting in the pipeline can also be fully taken into consideration. As always with these summit processes, the key actors wake up too late. Always, it's always like that. And they always go to sleep immediately after the summit. Maybe by postponing with a few months, we have an opportunity now to prepare better. And I see some promising steps on the African side. The African Union is indeed reacting on the European strategy. There are documents that will react on, for example, the Green Deal proposals, the Green Transformation Agenda of the European side. Africa will produce its own Green Deal in the next months. This is very useful. This is very promising. That's the way we should go into a kind of negotiated type of agreement.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to go on and on, because whatever you say, that and this last point was very interesting. I think that sounds very realistic. Let us see what comes. What I would like to say is thank you. And I very much hope that at least within Europe, we are going to travel a bit more, and that you will be able to come to Vienna, perhaps early in autumn, and we can continue such a conversation. I hope I speak also in the name of our Secretary General, Gertraud Borea-Dolmo, who is, I think, listening in. Thank you, Gert.
Thank you very much, Georg, and thank you very much, Gertraud. It's always a pleasure to be in touch with the Kreisky Forum. We've had some very good discussions in the past, and I very much support your initiatives because I think they are very needed. So if we can continue this type of discussions also with a physical presence, I'm definitely counting this in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.